Turn over to 1 Kings chapter 1. That's where we're going to be at today. 1 Kings chapter 1. And while you're turning over there is a lot of backstory that I have to give you to kind of catch you up to speed. This is the last week we'll be looking at David's life. We've been looking at him. You probably feel like we've been, looking at David's life forever. And it is such a full life. And I hope one of the things that you've gotten out of this, whether you have been here every single Sunday, whether you've been following along online, or maybe you've been going back through and listening to the different sermons online, or however you've been following along in this message series that we've been looking at, you've probably learned or looked at David's life more than maybe you have before. Because we tend to condense David's life down to a few moments. David and Bathsheba, David and Goliath. It's always David and someone. David and Jonathan. But we see that his life is so much more than just these flash moments that we're very familiar with. And indeed, he lives a very complex life. Unfortunately, we can't just fit him into that peg maybe that we're accustomed to. It's really interesting. Sarah and I were talking about the messages, and she was like, I'm really looking forward to being done with David because I really don't like him as much as I thought I would. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing, and here's why. Here's why. And I want you to hold on to this as we look at the end of David's life, which quite frankly doesn't start out as strong as when we first meet David. Understand that he is still known as the man after God's own heart. And someone as imperfect as this king still holds that promise that God will honor, that we'll celebrate here in just a few months, where born in the city of David is the King of Kings, the true King of Kings, the one who doesn't falter. And David gets to really share in that blessing, despite his blunders, despite the fact that we could say, based on the evidence, based on some of these stories, he's not the greatest person. I find a lot of comfort in that because, quite frankly, if you were going to survey my life, if you were going to do a sermon series on my life and really inspect it, hopefully there'd be some good triumphs. Hopefully there'd be some Sundays where you could leave really feeling good about my life, but there'd be some Sundays where you'd be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he's a Christian, much less a minister. If all of our stories were just laid to bear, if all of our skeletons were taken out of the closet, if all the monsters were pulled under the bed, out from under the bed, oh man, we would all have shame. And yet that is really the good news of our relationship with God. That God has given us a way to reconcile with him, despite the fact that we don't have a spotless record, despite the fact that we don't have perfect attendance in righteousness, because we don't do all things well all the time. And that's part of the purpose of the Bible giving us such a rich and complex life such as David's. But we've got to look at this story, and it's kind of a sad one. It's kind of a weird way to end his life because it's part of his life. I think a lot of ministers, when they're doing these types of message series, they kind of just skip over this, go right to Solomon because there's some good times ahead there. And we kind of miss some of the powerful moments here, which I really think have a lot to teach us about our faith, about the way we treat each other, about the way we value people in this life, in our lives. And hopefully really makes us think about how we value our families. Because that's really where David's story ends. It's a story of family. Now, to catch you up, I have mentioned a few times here and there, I've kind of peppered it in, that David becomes kind of a collector of sorts. He doesn't collect post stamps. He collects wives. In fact, as far as we can kind of tell, he has 8 official wives. He has other concubines. He has other things on the side. Yes, that's what that is. But David gets married 8 times, which pretty much qualifies him to be in a TLC reality show by our standards. 8 wives. And here's where it gets infinitely more complicated. By these 8 wives, he has 11 children. And most of the wives have at least one child born to them. And David is the king. Do you see where I'm going with this? Some of you are nodding your head. See, it's really good to be the king because you have power, because you have authority. Samuel, the prophet, you may remember him. He warned Israel about this. If you ask for a king, God gives you a king. That king is going to take your sons and take them to war. He's going to take your daughters and put them in service of the king. The king is going to reign and hold court, and he is going to have the power. And guess who has a front row seat to that power? All his sons. No, not daughters, because of course daughters can't be, the ruler in this day and age. And I love it because you will come across people who are not believers, and they'll point to this and say, oh man, the Bible is so misogynistic. I want to remind everyone of something that's so important. This was never God's ideal for any of these people. God's ideal was never for them to have a king. God's ideal certainly was not for these kings to get married multiple times to multiple women, having all these kinds of kids running around. This was not God's ideal. God is not a tyrant. He does not force us to act as he would. And because of that, we have access to God's love, but we also have to live with the consequences of our actions. David is never outside the love and forgiveness of God. We've seen it over and over and over again. Even when David screws up as bad as he does with the story of Bathsheba, God still finds a way to reconcile him. That is the incredible, amazing, permanent aspect, quality of God's love. It cuts through even the worst of our behaviors, the worst of our actions. But God's love does not just wipe away all our consequences. Because I think, and I believe you'd agree, consequences are part of love. How many of you have had children? Raise your hand. How many of you have had to discipline your child? Raise your hand. How many of you liked disciplining your child? Like, how many of you are like, yes, he didn't clean his room, and you got the punishment wheel out, and you just spun the wheel? Ding, 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 grounding for 2 weeks, and that means I'm grounded for 2 weeks because I have to enforce that nonsense. So why did you do it? Why did you punish your kid? Because you wanted to instill in them some values so that when they're out of your house someday, they'll do the right thing. That is the measure of consequence, the measure of love in consequences. And as much as God has demonstrated over and over and over again how much he loves David, he gives David this incredible promise that someday through his line, the King of Kings is going to come, someone who will establish a reign forever and ever. What an amazing thing. God never abandons David, and yet the fact of the matter is God is going to let David realize those consequences of his actions, of having 8 different wives, 11 different kids, and a huge power vacuum. And here's what happens. Here's what happens in the chapter between what we looked at last week and we're going to look at this week. David's firstborn, a son by the name of Amnon, pretty much believes he's untouchable because the firstborn always becomes the king. And the king can do whatever he wants. And he does something unspeakably evil. He desires his half-sister Tamar so much that he just takes her. And I'll let you go and read and figure that out. We don't need to get into the gritty details, but you need to know that's in there. Because it's a reminder, once again, that just because David has his heart right with God, it does not mean that his kids are going to. And we've seen that with Samuel. We saw that with Samuel's predecessor and mentor Eli. Faith is not transferred from parent to child. It's not. It is a choice that we have to make. And quite frankly, some of David's kids make the worst possible choice. Well, Tamar has a brother, another one of David's sons. In fact, some would argue David's favorite son, his third son, Absalom. Beautiful, incredible head of hair. Many people look at him and his record in the Bible and say, he probably would have been king. David probably would have chosen him king, passed over the others. Incredible warrior. And David makes a grave mistake. See, Amnon has done this terrible thing to David's daughter, to Absalom's full sister. And David kind of just lets it slide. Why? Because Amnon's the son of the king. Amnon's the firstborn. Amnon is in a place where he doesn't have to necessarily realize the full consequences of his actions. How many times do we see that with celebrities? How many times do we see that with sports figures and politicians? Do you think politicians get the same type of punishment by the law that you and I would? Not so. How many times do we see the celebrity get the slap on the wrist? And what is the first thing we say over and over and over again? Man, if that were you or me, if that was just a regular person. And that happened in David's household. And Absalom, he doesn't forget that. He's so angry with Amnon, even more so with David for doing nothing, that he leads a rebellion that is successful. And David and most of those loyal to David end up having to flee Jerusalem into the hills, into the caves. Here's David, an old man, living out his life much like he did as a young man. But Absalom's little insurrection, it begins to kind of crumble under the weight of itself. And as he's riding to meet David, he gets his hair caught in a tree. I told you, he had a heck of a head of hair. And David's commander, the guy who runs his army, kills him. And David weeps and he mourns. Yeah, the throne is reestablished and he comes back to power and he re-enters Jerusalem. But he re-enters a broken, old, befuddled man full of regrets. It's important for you to know that backstory because when we get to 1 Kings chapter 1, this is what the Bible tells us about the last days of David's life. When King David was very old, he could not keep warm even when they put covers on him. So his attendants said to him, "Let us look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him. She can lie beside him so that our lord the king may keep warm." Then they searched throughout Israel for a beautiful young woman and found Abishag, a Shunammite, and brought her to the king. The woman was very beautiful. She took care of the king and waited on him, but the king had no relations with her. Why does the Bible tell us that? What a strange thing for the Bible to include. Well, if you've been doing the math, how many wives does David have? He has 8. Probably about 6 that he's on good speaking terms with. One that he supposedly loves and lusts after so much so beautiful that he eventually commits murder for. Bathsheba, right? Bathsheba's gorgeous. But when David is an old man and he's broken and full of regrets, none of his wives seem to be there for him. How sad. How tragic. How awful. that at the end of this man, and he is a great man in many respects, at the end of his life, the king's life, he has 8 wives, and not a single one is there by his side. It's heartbreaking. It's heart-wrenching. And it should cause us to pause and ask, why did David marry those women? For love? Because when you love someone, you're with them to the very end. You take those vows at an altar, you say, to death do us part, in sickness and in health. And it does not matter what you're dealing with, you're there. My grandparents, unfortunately, just went to the hospital a few weeks ago. They've been dealing with a lot of really bad health issues. I know many of you have been praying for them, and I thank you so much. And my grandfather had to stay in the hospital. And my grandmother, who is not really in any better health right now than my grandfather, stayed with him all night, right by his side, took care of him. They had a nightmare, as many of you have had in the hospital, where they just got the wrong nurse or the wrong staff. They weren't as attentive. I won't go into the details, but I'm hearing this story, and I'm just thinking, how amazing is my grandmother? How lucky is my grandfather? That's love. And we have our priorities so wrong on what love is. And anytime someone from behind a pulpit starts to say that, especially people my generation, we just kind of cringe up. We don't want to hear it. Well, it's time for us to start just talking straight about what love is. It's not always what you feel. It can't just be sung in a song on Glee. It's so much more than that. Are you willing to pledge your life to another through the very best of times, through the absolute worst, when you have that rash on that foot that you wouldn't show anybody else? I just read a story the other day of a gentleman who won the lottery, and a few weeks later sent his wife a text saying, "I think we should break up." Pathetic. And the only thing more pathetic is the self-righteous inclination of today's Christians saying, well, we know better. We know what real love is. Well, why is the divorce rate about the same? Why are we constantly inundated with the story in the media of the pastor that runs off? Or the 400 pastors that had accounts with Ashley Madison? I'm not saying everybody has to be perfect. And oh, understand, I'm not. Don't get me wrong. This is not a message of everybody's got it wrong, but Josh will get you sorted out. And if Sarah were here today, she'd be just shaking her head no. I'm not perfect either. But we Christians, we tend to think that we are. We tend to think that we can tell everybody how they ought to live, forgetting that we've got the log jam in our eye. So we go back to the Word and we look at it and we look at these stories and we look at David's stories and we say he failed. He failed. And now he is living with the consequences of that failure. If you treat women like this in your life, they're not going to be with you at the end. If this is how you treat women, then this is what you get. And if your marriage is about power, or about influence, or convenience, or beauty, or just emotion, then it's probably not going to last. It's probably not going to last. These stories are here so we'll learn. And some of you are probably sitting there saying, well, why is this? What do I have to do with this? I have a good marriage. Some people in this room have been or were married to their spouses for 30, 40, 50 years. Congratulations. Honestly, that's amazing. I have had the most incredible blessing over the last 10 years knowing so many of you who have had incredible, wonderful, long-standing marriages. And now I find myself in a relationship with an incredible young woman who I love and admire and cherish. And I can tell you from the bottom of my heart, thank you, because so much of what I see in your relationships, I have tried to emulate. I've tried to learn. That is what this message is for you. You have this unique place of experience, and you can teach. And you can mentor. And some of you are sitting there going, well, I didn't get married to my spouse for 50 years. In fact, it didn't work out. Don't live in shame. Don't hang your head. Because guess what? My parents' first marriage didn't work out either. That's right. I'm the child of divorce. But I have a father who happens to not be my biological father, but a father, a real father who loves me, loves my brother. And I see in that relationship not only a second chance, but a reason to be hopeful. And some of you have that. And some of us have regret about the way relationships end. And if we're being honest, and this message is online, so it's a wide audience. There are some out there who have so much regret they haven't found that love. Maybe won't find that love. Here's my message to you from the Word of God, not from me, from the Word of God. Loneliness is hard. But it's far better to have no one than to have 8 people who don't love you at the end. Let me say that again. It's better to have no one, to have real relationships, because no one's an island. We have friendships, and we have the Lord. It's far better to have that genuine connection with people than to have 8 wives or 8 husbands or any combination that don't love you. When I look at the messaging today in the media, on television and in movies, in music, people are being asked to settle for a lot less than true love. And that may not be a feel-good message this Sunday morning, but that's the truth. And if we're not willing to deal with truth, then what kind of Christians are we? And if we're not willing to look at tough, painful stories such as the end of David's life, then we're not worthy of this eternal word that we've been given. Everybody take a deep breath. Oh, man, what a downer, right? Ugh. Here's the good news. Here's the good news. Not all of David's sons, not all of his children are lost causes. For just as one begins to set up shop, his name is Adonijah. He knew he wasn't going to be king because nobody can pronounce his name. Adonijah. just as he begins to kind of look around and saying, well, a lot of my brothers are dead by now, and some of the ones higher up than me are gone. Maybe I can kind of sneak in and take the throne for myself. David realizes, I've got to step up. I've got to make someone king. And in verse 28, he says, call in Bathsheba. So she came into the king's presence and stood before him. Then the king took an oath. As surely as the Lord lives, who has delivered me out of every trouble, I will surely carry out this very day what I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel. Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne in my place. Call in Zadok, verse 32, Nathan and Benaiah. When they came before the king, take your Lord's servants with you and have Solomon my son mount my own mule. Take him down to Gihon. There have Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him king over Israel. Blow the trumpet and shout, long live King Solomon. Then you are to go up with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah. And this is what Solomon does when he becomes king. And we'll look at a few of his stories a little more closely. Solomon, first and foremost, pours all of his newfound power, his mantle, into the building of God's temple. Maybe first to finish David's legacy, to fulfill the dying wish of a great man. But he eventually finds his own faith in the Lord. A faith that carries him to do the right thing by his people and lead them. Even when he's very young. We find in Solomon here the realization that no matter how bleak things are, no matter how bad people like David have screwed up, there is always hope in another generation. And God indeed guides our lives, our futures, and shapes our legacies. Samuel, Saul, and David. They all have something in common. And it's this. They all have regrets. Samuel's kids didn't turn out as virtuous as his own life did. Saul didn't quite follow God the way he was supposed to, time and time and time and time again. And David's mistreatment of women undermined what should have been his golden years. Instead of bouncing grandchildren on his knee and having those golden ages be full of laughter and love, they were cold. They were impersonal. They were hard. These are their regrets. And we have them so that we can understand, no matter how much power you have, whether you are the greatest prophet in the land or the greatest king, no matter whether you are God's hand-picked, chosen one, whether you are heads and shoulders above everybody else, Regrets will weigh you down. They are the result of missing the mark and allowing sin to reign in our lives. But they are not our whole story. And they do not determine our entire future. Hear me very carefully as we close this time in the Word and this time in David's life. We have given into a lie too much that it shapes our character and our outlook as Christians. And that lie is this: that we must be living in the end times because things are so terrible. The wrong person's president. Kids don't respect their elders like they used to anymore. Everything on TV is terrible, and so on and so forth. And it usually ends with this refrain: people just don't believe in God the way they used to. I could say that at the end of Samuel's time as leader, at the end of Saul's time as king, and now I could say that at the end of David's time as king. Guess what? You could say that at the end of Solomon's time and anyone else who comes. We can choose to look at a world and define it by the regrets that we and others carry. Or we can put our hope and trust and faith in God, the King of Kings, and realize resurrection. Because that is the great difference between all of these kings and the King of Kings. The King of Kings was taken out of the city limits and nailed to Roman timber. The King of Kings was pronounced dead at the scene. The King of Kings' clothes were divided amongst soldiers. The King of Kings' body was buried hurriedly in a borrowed tomb. And if that was the end of Jesus' story, then Paul's right. We would be people who are full of regrets, to be pitied more than anyone else on the face of the earth. Because Jesus' life would have ended no different than any of these people that we've looked at. It didn't end that way. That's not the end of the Christian story. On the third day, the stone rolled away. Light touched the cheek of the Messiah. The apostles felt the scars of his hands and feet. And the messenger said, "He is not here. He is risen." And for every generation that has heard and believed that message since, has realized that we do not live our lives cold and impersonal at the end, full of regrets and no way to reconcile the mistakes we've made. We have new life in a relationship that God has made possible through Jesus Christ. And so no matter how this story of woe finds you, whether it finds you thankful that you've had love in your life, or whether it finds you nursing your own wounds of regret, your story's not over. And neither is the story of your community and those around you. We are a faith and a people defined by hope, because the King of Kings has brought that to us. Because the Lord of Lords lives and walks in our life. It shows us, first and foremost, how to love one another as He has loved us. I'm sorry that David's life ends this way. And it is a painful yet important reminder to us who are living our lives of purpose now. But don't shake your head at the world you see today and sigh in your heart about what's lost, when you have so much to live for, to love for, to redeem, as God has redeemed each and every single one of us. Heavenly Father, today,